On June 23rd, 2018, a soccer coach in Thailand decided to take his team to go explore a cave. And so they planned on being in the cave for 1 hour. And while they were there, you probably remember this story, monsoon rains hit. And the caves were full of water very quickly. The team, the coach with 12 players, were trapped. Now, they were able to survive by drinking some water that were coming down from the cave. And they were told, and after all of this happened, the team would describe that they would kept repeating a mantra to themselves to keep fighting, to help everyone remain calm. And they did remain calm for a very, very long time. They were there from June 23rd until the last one was taken out at July 10th. You imagine. And what I wanted to talk about with this particular soccer team was they had great attitudes, they helped each other, they were there for each other, but the truth is, they couldn't save themselves. They tried to help through the difficulties, and they were there and they encouraged, but if nothing had happened, they all would have died in that cave. We know that wasn't the case. We know that Thai SEALs and Navy SEALs from other countries, British divers came, and they were able to get all of the kids and the coach out alive. But the coach and those kids could not save themselves. They needed someone else to go to extraordinary lengths to save their lives. And as I look at that story, sometimes I think when we look at Scripture, we forget the extraordinary lengths that God goes to save his people. We look at stories, and we've been looking at the life of Joseph, and we see all the things that he went through. We think about all of the pains and the trials he experienced, and he was a great man. He was a righteous man. But we have to remember that God did extraordinary things in the life of Joseph. God did extraordinary things in the life of Jacob, in the life of all of his sons. And we see that the salvation that God gives can only come from God and from no one else. Today we will be in Genesis chapter 42, beginning in chapter 42, as we continue on with looking at the life of Joseph. Last week, you might remember, we saw how Joseph went from a prisoner to second in command of all of Egypt. How God worked in amazing ways to take him out of the prison, to establish him. And as we left last week, we saw that he had a family. He had kids. And if you remember the name of his children, one child was Manasseh, the other was Ephraim, and their names spoke about how God had taken away Joseph's affliction. How God had given him fruit in the land of Egypt. We forget the pain and the struggle and the emotions that he had to endure through all of those years. And as we continue on, we're going to see, and I want you to notice this, look at the emotions that are described. Joseph was not some robot that we read about who didn't hurt, who didn't experience pain. We are going to see so many emotions described in this passage. And I think it's important for us to see that as God's people go through these stories that we read about, and we know the ending, so we don't get as involved as we should, as if we were reading it for the first time. But when they were living it, those emotions were real, and they were strong and powerful. And they remind us that God is so good to us and to his people. So if we look at chapter 42, what's happening, the famine had been in the land. Remember, the famine there was going to be 7 years of plenty, then 7 years of famine. During the 7 years of plenty, Joseph stored up crops so that Egypt would have enough to make it through the 7 years of famine. Well, now the story shifts back to Jacob, who is in Israel with his 11 sons. And in Israel, Jacob did not have stored up 7 years worth of food. And so, like all of the region around them, Jacob and his family run out of food. There's no grain to be found. If they don't do anything, they're all going to die. So they hear that there is food in Egypt. So Jacob tells his sons, go down to Egypt and bring back food for the family. Now, he does tell them that Benjamin is staying. So 10 of the 11 sons who are with him go to Egypt. Jacob didn't send Benjamin because Benjamin was the youngest. We know Benjamin was one of his favorites. And after Joseph had died, seems like he's very protective of Benjamin. And so the 10 sons go down to Egypt. And look at verse 6 of chapter 42. It says, now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. What's so important about this verse? It was the fulfillment of the prophecy, remember? Joseph had a dream when he was a young man that one day his brothers would come and bow down to him. Remember, there was the picture of the sheaves of wheat bowing down to Joseph's sheaf, and how his brothers hated him because of this prophecy and were jealous of him. Well, now we fast forward years and years into the future. The brothers thought Joseph had died. The brothers thought he was a slave somewhere. They thought nothing had come of him. And now we see God fulfilling the promises he gave years and years and years ago. God keeps his word. And in this particular situation, God did miraculous things to bring about the circumstances that Joseph's brothers bowed down to him in fulfillment of the prophecy. Look at verse 7. It says, Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. Where do you come from, he said. They said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. And he said to them, you are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. Now, this is part of the story that I've always had a lot of questions about. Joseph sees his brothers. He recognizes them. But he doesn't come out and tell them who he is. He, in fact, treats them very poorly. He treats them as if they are spies. We're going to see all of the things that he does to his brothers throughout the course of this passage, where he imprisons some of his brothers, he lies to them, he tricks them, he does all of these things to them, and you think, Joseph, what's going on here? Well, I think we have to really put this in perspective. The last time Joseph saw his brothers, what were they doing to him? They threw him in a pit and were going to leave him to die. And then they sold him into slavery. Joseph, the last impression he had of his brothers, they were wicked, evil people, right? They were bent on doing harm to Joseph and trying, I think, to destroy the prophecy of the dream that he had. They were not good. And I think what we're going to see in how Joseph reacts to his brothers, I think Joseph is testing his brothers to see if they have changed. We're going to see, it's interesting, we're going to see that part of the trial has to do with leaving brothers behind. We're going to see first with Simeon, that's coming up here in a little bit, or that he has to stay behind in the land while his brothers go home. Later, it's Benjamin, and it seems to be this idea, how are they going to treat their brother? And in some ways, we might think this cruel, but in other ways, we see how God is using all of these things to not only provide for the family's food, but to renew that family relationship that had been broken. To restore a broken relationship between Joseph and all of his brothers. To build back the trust that had been destroyed by the actions of his brothers against him. And God is using this in Joseph's life and also in the lives of his brothers. And he's going to, in the end, bring about blessing to this family that had been so hurt over the years because of the sinful choices the brothers had made. So Joseph is not telling his brothers who he is. Joseph is not revealing the truth because he is testing them. And the brothers, of course, say, no, we're not spies. We're just here trying to get food for our family. And they describe what their family is like. They talk about the youngest that's still at home. Joseph was probably wondering, they tried to kill me. What did they try to do to Benjamin? So he hears that Benjamin is still at home. He hears his father is alive. And then in verse 18, if we jump down there, it says on the third day, oh, by the way, he bound them up for 3 days after they came. It says, on the third day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households. And bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die. And they did so. Then they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brothers, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we would not listen. This is why this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered, did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. They did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. Then he turned away from them and wept. And he returned to them and spoke to them. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and replace every man's money in his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. This was done for them. In this situation, the brothers recognize their guilt. They know what they have done. And notice we get some insight into what the situation was like when they put Joseph in the pit. Sounds like Joseph was begging and pleading with them. And remember what the passage said? They sat down and ate. They ignored the pleas of their brother. They were callous to his well-being. And now they're in a place where they see that they think in their minds God is repaying them for all of the wrongs they have done. Now, something we see in this passage, that is God teaching them a lesson? Absolutely. But we also see the mercy of God in this passage. That these brothers are guilty. They've done some horrible things. They treated their brother horribly, but yet there is forgiveness and grace even for them. And Joseph, we see that emotion here, that as he hears his brothers, he breaks down and weeps and cries because he understands what's going on. And the hurt and the pain of all of those years is flooding back. Now Joseph plays a trick on them. He sends them home, but he puts their money in their bag. In some ways, it seems like Joseph is playing with their minds. He's playing mind games with them. He's trying to put them in a state where they are constantly on edge, where they are constantly at a disadvantage, where they feel as if their lives could be in danger. I mean, he is making the situation so they realize that things are not going well, and they're scared. And they're scared. So they go back home. They give the food to their family. They tell their father that one of their brothers is left behind. And they wait. Because Jacob doesn't want to send his son Benjamin to Egypt. He already lost Joseph, and he does not want to lose Benjamin too. And so all the while, one of the brothers is sitting in prison in Egypt. I think we see some parallels with Joseph, just like Joseph sat in prison for something he didn't do. Now his brother is going through that situation. And so Jacob gets to the point where they're out of food. Jacob gets to the point where there's nothing left. And so he realizes they have to go back to Egypt, and the only way they can go back is if Benjamin goes with them. Look at verse 11 of chapter 43. We're skipping down to chapter 43. Look at verse 11. It says, "Then their father Israel said to them, 'If it must be so, then do this. Take some of the choice food of the land in your bag and carry a present down to the man, a little balm, a little honey, gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. Take double the money with you. Carry back with you the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. Take also your brother, and arise, go again to the man. May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, and may he send back your brother in Benjamin. As for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved.'" In this situation, we see Jacob suffering. The whole story of Joseph shows Jacob, his father, suffering. Suffering because he thinks Joseph is dead. Suffering because now he has to let go of Benjamin with the possibility something bad might happen to Benjamin. All that is going on in the life of Jacob is a struggle in these passages. And we often talk about the sons, but really what we see is the sons' decisions brought so much pain and sorrow to Jacob's life. And we will also see that just as sin brings sorrow and pain, that God is able to renew our joy, as he's going to do with Jacob. So the passage continues. They take the present, they go back, they bring Benjamin with them. And Benjamin comes and is there before Joseph, and Joseph sees all that is going on. And he takes Simeon out and brings them to him, and everything seems to be going well. They get the food that they need. And let's pick it up in verse 26. It says, "When Joseph came home, they brought him into the house to him, the present that they had with them, and they bowed down to him to the ground." Once again, it emphasizes that they bowed. "And he inquired about their welfare and said, 'Is your father well? The old man of whom you speak, is he still alive?' They said, 'Your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive.' And they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves." I think we see this repetition of they bowed, they bowed, they bowed. I think Moses wants us to see and not miss the fact that God is fulfilling his word. I think that's purposeful in this passage. God is showing us this happened just as I said it would. Verse 29, "He lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. And he said, 'Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke? God be gracious to you, my son.' Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep. and he entered his chamber and wept there. This is the second time Joseph is overwhelmed with emotion and has to go and weep. The first time when he saw his brothers and he saw the guilt that was on their hearts. The second time when he sees Benjamin and he goes and finds a place so that they don't see, and he weeps and cries and is overwhelmed with emotion of seeing his brother again. Verse 31, then he washed his face and came out, and controlling himself, he said, serve the food. And they served him by himself and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. Then they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in amazement. Portions were taken to them from Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portions was 5 times as much as theirs. And they drank and were merry with him. Continuing on in chapter 44, it says, then he commanded the stewards of his house, fill the man's sack with food, as much as they can carry, and put each man's money in the mouth of his sack, and put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, with his money for the grain. And he did as Joseph told him. As soon as the morning was light, the men set away with their donkeys. They had gone only a short distance from the city. Now Joseph said to his steward, go follow after the man, and when you overtake them, say to them, why have you repaid evil for good? Is it not from this that my Lord drinks, and by this that he practices divination? You have done evil in doing this. When he overtook them, he spoke to them these words. They said, why does my Lord speak such words as these? Far be it from your servant to do such a thing. Behold, the money that we found in the mouths of our sacks we brought back to you from the land of Canaan. How then could we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house? Whichever of your servants is found with it shall die, and we also will be the Lord's servant. He said, let it be as you say. He who is found with it shall be my servant, and the rest of you shall be innocent. Then each man quickly lowered his sack to the ground, and each man opened his sack, and he searched, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Then they tore their clothes, and every man loaded his donkey and returned to the city. When Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, he was still there. They fell before him to the ground. And Joseph said to them, what deed is this that you have done? Do you not know that a man like me can indeed practice divination? And Judah said, what shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are your Lord's servants, both we and he also, in whose hand the cup has been found. But he said, far be it from me that I should do so. Only the man in whose hand the cup was found shall be my servant. But as for you, go up in peace to your father. Joseph has set up the situation so Benjamin looks guilty. He set up the situation so his brothers have a choice. Are they going to treat Benjamin like they treated him? Are they going to abandon Benjamin like they abandoned Joseph? Are they going to be callous to the life of Benjamin like they callously ignored the pleas of Joseph? This is all a part of the test where Joseph is trying to see if his brothers had changed, if God had been working in their lives over the years just as he had worked in his life. He wanted to know what they will do when Benjamin's life is in the balance. And he sets up this elaborate test where all of a sudden they have to decide what they are going to do with the life of their youngest brother. And what we see happening is Judah steps up. Judah, who was once callous to the cries of Joseph, said, "Take me instead. I'll stay. I'll go to prison. I'll pay the price. I'll be your servant. Just let Benjamin go." And although so often we spend so much time looking at what God has done in the life of Joseph, what we see in the life of Judah is a complete transformation. That Judah realizes the guilt of what he had done. Judah realizes the pain that he brought his father. And now in a very similar situation, he is willing to give of himself instead of letting his brother die in Egypt as a slave. God has been working throughout the lives of these families, the brothers up in Canaan, Joseph down in Egypt, but yet God is involved and he's working everything together according to his perfect plan. Even though I'm sure Joseph at times questioned what God was doing, I'm sure Judah and the brothers questioned what God was doing, but behind the scenes, God was working everything together according to his plan. And it gets to the point where Joseph can't take it any longer. And in chapter 45, verse 1, it says, "Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, 'Make everyone go out from me.' And no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?' But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence." You know, Joseph is overwhelmed with emotions. We can see his joy, and his brothers are reacting the exact opposite way. They're like, "Oh no, we're in trouble," right? They've already seen how Joseph has treated them. He hasn't been kind to them. He's tricked them. He's done all of these things to make it look like they're guilty. And so they're probably thinking, "Oh no, we're going to get it. This is it. Joseph is going to get his payback. He is going to repay us for all of the evil that we did to him." But look at verse 4. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." They came near. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." This part of the passage I just struggle with. God is saying, or Joseph says to his brothers, "Don't worry about that. Don't worry about what you did. Don't be distressed. Don't be angry at those decisions that you made that were evil, that were wicked, that probably filled them with guilt." Joseph says, "Don't worry, because you didn't sell me down to Egypt. God brought me here." Joseph was able to see in that moment that God had a plan that was larger than the decisions of his brothers, that was bigger than the evil intentions that they had, but God was working through his brothers and through him so that he could preserve the life of this family. Verse 6, he says, "For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God." Through all that happens, Joseph is able to see the big picture. And he isn't angry at his brothers. He doesn't allow the bitterness of the hurt that his brothers had caused against him to get in the way. He is able to see that God was doing something in their lives, and God was using the situation to save his people. The rest of the passage describes how Joseph calls for his father, and how his father Jacob comes down and is reunited with his son. And what we see in this passage, a family that was broken, relationships that were broken, God restores. God makes new. And as we look at this passage, there's two things I think this passage teaches us that are so important, that we see in the lives of these people, but also are true in the lives of all believers and followers of Christ. The first thing I think this passage teaches us is that God fulfills his word. God told Joseph that his brothers would bow down. And although it took years, and although it took a path nobody envisioned, God fulfilled his word. Now, have you ever seen those Rube Goldberg machines? Do you know what those are? Okay, Rube Goldberg machines are machines that use chain reactions to carry out a very simple task. Right? You've probably seen some of these like on Facebook or internet or whatever, where, maybe the task is to put a ball in a cup, but it goes through this thing and it hits and it falls down and it's like one chain reaction after the other that at the end fulfills something that should be a fairly normal task, right? Now, as I was thinking about this week, and I was thinking about what God did, and not that it was a simple task, it wasn't, but I thought about all the chain reactions that were necessary for God's word to be fulfilled. And as you look at some of those contraptions, you realize these people are ingenious to come up with all of these creative ways to make this process happen. And God very often does not do things the way we think he's going to do. Sometimes God takes us to places in our lives that we never expected. Sometimes God allows hurt in our life that we don't think we deserve. There are times in our life that don't make sense. There's times in our lives where we are afraid and overwhelmed and confused. And it's times like that where we could question whether God will do what he says he will do. This passage reminds us that God will fulfill his promises. Now, our promises aren't like Joseph's. I've never been promised that my siblings will bow down to me, and if they did, that'd be pretty weird. I don't know what I would do. But you know what God does promise us? God promises us that all things work together for the good to those who love God. Now, that doesn't mean our life will be full of ease and comfort. It means that in the end, we will see the goodness of God in our lives. We will see how God has been faithful, how God has been good, how God orchestrates our lives for his purpose. And sometimes it includes going through trials like Joseph did. We're also promised that nothing can separate us from the love of God. That passage is so amazing. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. We're promised that he will never leave us, never forsake us. We are promised so many things as children of God. And even though there may be times where we question what is going on in our lives and our lives don't make sense and it doesn't seem as if God is there, we have to remember that God will keep his word. The second thing we need to remember as we look at this passage is God preserves or saves his people. God preserves his people. God saves his people. as we look at this passage, this family that God had promised this covenant to, beginning with Abraham, they reached a place where they were on the verge of all dying. Where they were at the verge of famine. They were, their lives were very close to dying because of starvation. But God stepped in and saved his people. Joseph speaks of that when he says to his brothers, God brought me here to preserve life. God brought me here to protect his people so that his covenant would stand. And I just want to encourage us that God preserves our lives too. Now, that doesn't mean that we will never die. That doesn't mean we will never suffer. That doesn't mean that bad things won't happen to us. What this means is God has promised that he will do what he said he would do. And with the Old Testament, it was the covenant that he made with Abraham. But in the New Testament, it talks about the church, and it says the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. And so we live in a time where we maybe feel threatened. We maybe feel in danger of certain things. But we need to remember, just as God was with his people in the Old Testament, God says nothing will overcome the church, his people. And so although we're threatened, although we're in danger, although we're persecuted, we have to remember that God will not allow his people to be wiped out, to be overcome. That even though we experience the pain that this life has to offer, God is with us, God will be with us, he will protect us, he will not abandon us. And I just want to leave you with those words. Remember, as we look at this passage, God fulfills his word. And in your life, I'm sure there are things where that is coming into question right now. We need to be reminded God is faithful to his promises. And God will preserve and protect and save his people. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much as we look at these stories from your word. People who lived long, long time ago. And we see that although this happened a long time ago, you have not changed. You still keep your word. You still preserve your people. And I pray, Lord, that you will help us have faith. I pray that you will increase our faith. I pray that we will see how sweet it is to trust in you. To trust what you've done on the cross and to trust that you are in control. I pray, Lord, that you will help us to trust more and more and more. In your name,